right, historians, it's Unit 6, Notes 2, Part 4. Today we're doing the last bit of the Cold War. Today we're focusing on the proxy wars, and I'll explain what that means in a second. But the proxy wars that were fought during the Cold War era. Okay, so you're going to find the part in your notes that have Korean War and Vietnam War. As the superpowers armed themselves with more and more powerful weapons, like we talked about with the nuclear arms race, both nations realized that a war fought directly between them would end up in a nuclear disaster with no winners. Everybody would just be obliterated. There were enough nuclear weapons stockpiled to destroy each other many times over. So instead of fighting directly a war, the U.S. and the Soviet Union fought what we call proxy wars. They're substitute wars. They were conflicts in other parts of the world where each of the superpowers supported and allied with opposing sides. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is going to happen on the peninsula of the Korean Peninsula here. The first of these proxy wars took place on the Korean Peninsula from 1950 to 1953. After Japan lost World War II, the Korean Peninsula was occupied by both the U.S. and Soviet troops. The Soviets established a communist government in North Korea. In South Korea, America was advocating for a government that favored democratic values and capitalism. In 1950, North Korean troops armed with tanks and weapons provided by the Soviet Union invaded South Korea. So you can see the United States and the Soviet Union are not fighting a war between the U.S. and Soviet Union, but they are supporting two different sides of a civil war in the Korean Peninsula. Okay? So Soviets backing the North, United States and other NATO troops supporting the South. So you're going to write down the definition of a proxy war. It's a war where the world superpowers did not directly fight, but they supported opposing sides. The United States foreign policy was containment. This was to stop communism, to contain it in one place, to prevent it from spreading to other nearby countries. President Truman ordered the United States military to support the South Korean government. With help from the United Nations and NATO, the United States pushed the communist invaders nearly out of North Korea entirely. However, China had also become communist nation ruled by dictator Mao Zedong, and he sent 300,000 Chinese soldiers into North Korea to drive the UN troops, most of which were United States troops, back to South Korea. There's Mao. President Truman feared the war for Korea would spread into another world war. In order to avoid this, Truman began pushing for a peace settlement. So we already have proxy war. Here's UN troops, 90% of them American, fought communist North Korea. Communist China drove the UN troops back. So it's these communist nations that were allied against all of the nations that were a part of the United Nations that were for peace and diplomacy and also capitalism and democracy. So you're going to write down a super quick summary of what was a 3-year war. Communist North Korea, with help from the Soviet Union and China, invaded democratic South Korea. The United States and 10 United Nations countries sent over 500,000 troops to help defend South Korea. The war ended in a stalemate when President Truman feared the struggle would widen into a world war. The agreement that formally ended the Korean War in 1953 resulted in a stalemate. Neither side won or lost the war. Instead, the peninsula was divided, and North Korea is still to this day governed by communist dictators, many of whom they've kind of been successors and sons of the original communist leadership there. Okay. While South Korea has an established democracy, they have elected leaders, and they have a capitalist economy. The dividing line between Communist North Korea and the Democratic South Korea is a heavily guarded demilitarized zone, or DMZ for short. U.S. troops helped South Korean troops still to this day help South Korean troops guard this border daily. While the Americans were not happy that North Korea remained communist, at least they felt that this was a successful war because our goal was not necessarily eliminating communism, but to contain it where it already existed and not let it spread. And we did that, so we were able to make sure that North Korea did not spread communism into South Korea. And we were able to do that without a world war. So can you write down the definition of a stalemate, please? It's a war ending with neither side winning. The peninsula remains divided to this day. Okay, here's the dividing line, and it's right along this line of latitude on the map. This is what we call the DMZ, demilitarized zone. This is at the 38 degrees north latitude line, and it divides communist North Korea with democratic South Korea. North Korea is still communist, and it's probably one of the biggest threats to the United States national security or in the safety of the world today, because the leadership is pretty unstable. Some crazy weirdos. You'll learn next year in 8th grade a lot more about what life in communist North Korea is like and why that is such kind of still a hot spot in world issues. Okay, there's a video here about the DMZ. So you can kind of see the area background there. So Kim Jong-il has recently passed away within the last couple of years, and his son took over, and he's just as crazy as his dad. So there you go. That was not the only proxy war we fought. In 1954, the Southeast Asian nation of Vietnam won its independence from France. It had been a colony of France. Elections were being held in 1956. They were supposed to be held for the Vietnamese people to decide the future of their government. When it appeared that the people were going to choose communism, the United States felt that this was not a good plan, and so they sent advisors to meet with some leaders in South Vietnam to try and stop the country from becoming communist. Okay, so there's used to be French Indochina, okay, controlled by France, and then it's wins its independence. Originally, the United States only sent a few hundred military advisors to back the anti-communist leaders of South Vietnam and help them take control of the southern half of the country. By the early 1960s, a civil war in Vietnam was being waged between the communist North and the anti-communist South. Okay, this is Ho Chi Minh. This is who the U.S. feared would take over the whole entire nation of Vietnam. In 1963, President Lyndon B Johnson had to decide how far he was going to go in supporting the government of South Vietnam. The United States had been supporting the policy of containment to stop communism from spreading. Johnson received a congressional approval of a resolution that he felt gave him authority to send more troops to Vietnam to expand military involvement in that part of the world. Now, remember when we talked about the powers of the three branches of government? The president does not have the power to declare war. It actually has to go to a vote before Congress, and Congress would have to formally issue a declaration of war against a nation, and that will never happen for the Vietnam War. So some people technically call it a Vietnam conflict, but I think that that's kind of a slight to all of these tens of thousands of Americans who went there, served there, fought and died there. It was a war, and it was a very hellish war. In 1965, there were 180,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. By 1968, President Lyndon B Johnson had increased that number to over 500,000, and the United States was entrenched in a full-scale war against North Vietnam under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong Army, a war that Congress had never technically declared. The North Viet Cong rebel forces fought using what we call guerrilla tactics, not like a big ape, okay? This is a style of fighting that is not a traditional wartime style of fighting. This is sneaking around, booby traps, tunnels, um, tricks, yeah, anything that you can think of that is deceptive and trickery, that's what they were up against. So they transported soldiers, supplies, and weapons back and forth between North and South Vietnam using a system of underground tunnels and a network of trails through neighboring Laos and Cambodia. So here's, you can't even see, you see how small the entrance to that tunnel is? Okay, and here's fake ones. Then they would have these traps set up, and you can see if someone fell in there, that would pierce their leg and they'd be wounded pretty badly. U.S. soldiers, most of whom who had been drafted, did not sign up for this war. They struggled in this dense region of jungles and thick grasslands, fighting an enemy that seemed invisible by day. The Viet Cong would disappear into their tunnel system or put on civilian clothing and blend in with the population. You couldn't really tell a North Vietnamese from a South Vietnamese. You couldn't tell a Viet Cong from a civilian. So many innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire. Okay, there you can see in the background there's some tunnel system. Would you please write down the very short, I feel like this doesn't really do it justice because the Vietnam War was the longest military engagement that we had participated in as a nation. The country of Vietnam split into the Communist North and Democratic South after the country won independence from France in 1954. In 1963, Lyndon B Johnson increased military presence in South Vietnam to try and prevent the spread of communism. President Richard Nixon ultimately withdrew all U.S. troops from Vietnam in 1973, and the country reunited as one communist party. So this is where we fail. Our method of containment is not met. Our goal of containment is not met, and you can see that the whole nation ends up as communist. Also write down the definition of Viet Cong. They are the North Vietnamese military forces. We talked about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of roads, tunnels, and trails used to transport soldiers and supplies by the Viet Cong. Would you please maybe label that as well? And then the draft. This required military service from males ages 18 to 25. They could elect to serve after college. This is going to create that option to elect to serve in the military after college. That's going to make kind of a discrepancy between the kids, the young men who have the money to go to college and the grades and the educational opportunities as high school students to be accepted into college. If you didn't have those things, if your family was not wealthy enough, if you lived in a less than desirable neighborhood with poor schools, you were not going to have that option to put your military service on hold and escape that draft. So this unfair setup really causes a lot of Americans to take a good look at our government and start to question some things as, hey, wait a second, this is, in some instances they felt it was racist because this meant that minorities like African Americans who didn't have necessarily the same opportunities as others, they weren't going to be able to put that on hold. They were going to have to be drafted. Okay, there these men are helping a brother, in their unit, a man in their unit, out of one of those traps. While Lyndon B Johnson chose not to run for office again, Richard Nixon was elected with hopes that he would bring an end to the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Many Americans had grown tired of the war, much of which was broadcast on nightly television news. Young people in particular were frustrated that so many of their generation were dying fighting Vietnam's Civil War. So the United States, when we talked about World War II, we talked about a ton of support on the home front, where Americans were working together to make the war a victory. This is not the case in the Vietnam War. Nixon ultimately brought troops out of Vietnam, but only after it had expanded into Laos and Cambodia, which caused even more fighting, argument, and anti-war feelings. Okay, sadly, many of the returning veterans were not kindly welcomed home. Sometimes they were spat at and treated very unfairly, and this has been something that we've dealt with in response to that. So make sure you get down in 1973, U.S. troops left Vietnam. You already have 1991 filled in, and that is going to conclude our notes on the Cold War. Thanks for listening.